She hadn't opened her door to a man in 20 years, until one winter night, a half-frozen cowboy collapsed on her porch and whispered, "Please, just let me stay." The wind screamed across the Montana hills that night, tearing through pine and bone alike. In a cabin built for silence, Etta Collins stirred her fire and her loneliness until 3 desperate knocks shattered both. When she opened the door, the storm delivered not death, but a man with smoke-blue eyes and a voice that would change every quiet hour she'd ever known. The wind howled across the plains like a wounded animal, clawing at the corners of the small cabin until its timbers groaned. Snow came down sideways, thick as wool, erasing every shape and sound beyond the flicker of the single oil lamp on the table. Inside, Etta Collins sat by the stove, feeding another log to the fire. She had learned to count the years by winters, 39 of them now, and this one felt colder than most. The knock came hard. 3 times, heavy enough to rattle the hinges. For a long second, she didn't move. Out here, no one came after dark. No one came at all. The second round of pounding came faster, more desperate, like fists trading their last strength for a chance to be heard. Etta's eyes went to the rifle above the hearth, then to the latch on the door. Her heart argued both ways, fear whispering one thing, mercy another. Outside, the storm roared again, a living thing ready to devour whoever stood against it. Then through the wind came a voice, hoarse and breaking. "Please, shelter." She pulled the latch. The door blew open, snow crashing in. A man stumbled forward, collapsing half inside, half out, his coat glazed in white, hat sagging low over a face carved by wind and road. She caught him under the arms, dragging him across the threshold. His weight was dead heavy, his breath ragged, his skin burning with cold. "Easy now," she muttered, though her own hands shook. She kicked the door shut, sealing out the shriek of the storm, and guided him toward the hearth. The fire snapped and spat as if startled by the intrusion. She eased him down before it, stripped the frozen gloves from his hands, and rubbed them between hers until the skin began to color again. He was older than she'd first thought, early 40s maybe, sun-browned beneath the frost, with a beard that looked grown more from neglect than vanity. A small leather case hung from his shoulder, its strap stiff with ice. When she reached to unfasten it, his eyes flickered open, gray-blue, smoke-colored, clear despite exhaustion. "I won't rob you," she said quietly. "Didn't think you would," he rasped, and then a faint smile ghosted across his cracked lips before sleep claimed him again. Etta sat back on her heels, staring at the stranger she'd just pulled into her solitude. She'd spent 10 winters alone since the fire that took the school, and her place among people. The lamp burned low beside her, the flame trembling with each gust that pressed against the walls. She watched his chest rise and fall, slow but steady. Outside, the blizzard beat against the door, but its sound had changed. It no longer screamed to be let in. It only sighed, as though relieved that someone, somewhere, had chosen not to let another soul freeze. Etta rose, fetched another quilt, and covered him. She could smell the dust of long roads on his coat, the faint scent of horse and smoke. As she turned to refill the lamp, the glass chimed softly against its brass frame. One fragile sound of life in the long, white silence. The wind shifted. The flame steadied, and in that quiet moment, Etta Collins realized she was not afraid. By morning, the storm had dulled from fury to breath. The world outside the cabin lay buried beneath a shroud of white, so thick it looked as if the sky had fallen and decided to stay. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of smoke and thawing leather. The man slept still, stretched out before the fire, his body trembling now and then like an animal caught between worlds. Etta moved quietly. She boiled water, poured it into a tin bowl, and began to clean the frost burns that striped his fingers. His hands were rough, hands that had known reins and rope, not ink or coin. When she pressed the warm cloth to his skin, he winced, then sighed as the blood began to move again. He opened his eyes slowly, the same smoke blue she'd glimpsed the night before. "Where am I?" "Alive," she answered, wringing the cloth. "That's all that matters for now." He studied her face, not with suspicion, not with gratitude either, just the calm gaze of a man trying to place himself back in the living. "Reed Dawson," he said after a moment. "I was crossing the ridge when my horse went down. Didn't mean to trouble you." "Trouble's already come," she said, pouring him tea. "Might as well sit by it." He tried to smile, but the muscles in his face seemed to have forgotten how. His voice was softer when he spoke again. "You saved me." Etta shook her head. "The fire did." They sat in a silence that was neither awkward nor easy, just quiet enough for the crackle of wood to carry. She saw how he kept glancing toward the small leather case on the table, its edges still damp from melted snow. Curiosity tempted her, but she didn't ask. In a town that never forgave her curiosity, she'd learned the mercy of letting silence stand. When he reached for the cup, his fingers shook. Without thinking, she steadied it for him. Their hands brushed. One rough, one slender, both marked by cold. The contact lasted a heartbeat too long, and she pulled away first. The tea rippled. The lamp flame danced as if it, too, had felt the tremor. Later, when the storm rose again in fitful gusts, Reed dozed by the fire. Etta returned to her chair by the window. From there she could see nothing, only the pale blur of snow against glass. Yet her eyes stayed fixed on it, as though behind that curtain might appear some truth she'd been waiting for all her life. The hours drifted. Reed woke and began to speak of horses, of roads swallowed by dust and silence. His words came slow, each one like a step testing fragile ice. She listened, answering mostly with nods. It had been so long since another voice had filled these walls that she feared saying too much might break the spell. When night fell again, she brought him a bowl of soup and watched him eat. He thanked her with a nod, nothing more. But when he finished, he took the violin from the case. The neck was cracked, one string missing, the wood dulled with age. He turned it in his hands as if weighing a lost friend. "You play?" she asked quietly. "Used to," he said. "Before I broke it. Before a lot of things broke." She said nothing. He set it on the table, beside the lamp. The broken instrument caught the light, and for a moment seemed whole again. Etta stoked the fire and poured herself a cup of tea. "You can stay until the storm ends," she said, almost as if telling herself. "After that, the road will be yours again." Reed nodded, but his gaze lingered on the flame, the violin, and finally on her. "If it's all the same," he murmured, "I might wait a little longer. Storms have a way of pretending to be over when they're not." Etta didn't answer. She just added another log to the fire, and watched the sparks rise. Outside, the wind pressed its ear against the cabin, but seemed unwilling to enter. She thought of how many winters had passed since another soul had shared her fire. And as she sat across from the stranger whose life had brushed hers by accident, she felt a strange calm, like the first warmth after years of frost. The lamp burned lower, the flame steady now, its glass clear of smoke. Reed's breathing evened out, and soon the only sounds were the storm's dying sigh and the quiet rhythm of two hearts learning, unknowingly, to match each other's pace. By the third day, the storm quieted to a dull hiss that clung to the windows like breath on glass. The land beyond the cabin had turned into an endless white plain, broken only by the ribs of the hill where the wind had stripped away the snow. Reed's strength had returned enough for him to split kindling, though he still moved with the caution of a man who'd lived too long on the edge of things. Etta watched from the doorway, her shawl pulled tight. He swung the hatchet carefully, each strike even, measured. No waste in motion, no noise beyond what was needed. When he paused to catch his breath, the silence around him was so deep, it seemed to listen back. "You don't have to do that," she said finally. He straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Can't sit idle while someone else keeps me alive." "You're not in debt," she replied. He glanced toward the hill, toward the thin smoke rising from its far slope. "You might be wrong about that." Etta followed his gaze and saw what he meant. Dark shapes moving below, the glint of harness, a horseman turning. Her pulse quickened. Nobody came this far up the ridge unless they had reason. And every reason she could think of carried the weight of a name she'd spent 10 years trying to forget. "Someone's down there," she whispered. Reed stepped closer to the door, squinting into the glare. "Looks like a pair of riders, maybe more. Folks from town?" "Maybe," she said. "They keep their distance, mostly." But they didn't. That afternoon, boot prints appeared near the edge of her porch, half filled with drifted snow. A scrap of cloth caught on a fence post fluttered like a warning. Etta gathered it in her hand, a torn corner of a feed sack, stenciled with the mark of the Grant family, the same one that had once owned the land where her school stood before the fire. Her stomach tightened. When Reed came in from the yard, she dropped the cloth into the stove. "You said you were passing through," she said quietly. "You running from something?" He looked at her, the light from the hearth catching in his gray-blue eyes. "Everyone's running from something. You too, I'd wager." She held his gaze until the words lost their sting. "You don't know me." "Not yet," he said, and his voice was calm, not challenge, but truth. That night, the wind shifted east, carrying faint sounds from the valley, hooves, the echo of distant voices. Etta doused the lamp, leaving only the red pulse of coals in the grate. Reed's shadow stretched long across the floor as he moved to the window, his figure blending with the dark. "They'll talk if they see smoke up here," he murmured. "What is it they think you've done?" Etta's throat tightened. "They don't need a reason. A rumor will do." He nodded, understanding too easily. Then, without asking, he took her rifle from its place on the wall and checked the chamber. "I'll keep watch tonight." "You won't need to." "Maybe not," he said, "but it's something I can do." Etta didn't argue. She returned to her chair, the shawl still wrapped around her shoulders, and listened to the faint creak of the floorboards as he paced. She should have felt uneasy. Instead, there was an odd steadiness in the sound of his steps, like the slow beat of a clock marking time through a long night. Just before dawn, she woke to find the fire low and Reed still standing by the window. The world outside glowed faintly blue, the first color after days of white. He turned when she stirred, his face drawn but alert. "Tracks," he said simply. Someone came close, then turned back. Etta rose, pulling her coat tight. "They'll spread word soon that you're here." Reed nodded. "Then it's better I stay, at least for now." She frowned. "Stay? You'd be safer heading out before they—" He set the rifle back on the wall, his movements slow, deliberate. "Safer's never been the point. If they're coming for you, they'll have to see I'm here too." The words hung between them, quiet but heavy as snow on the roof. Etta felt something stir in her chest, an old ache mixed with gratitude, too fragile to name. She turned away before it showed on her face. Outside, daylight began to lift the fog from the valley. The shapes of fences and trees emerged again, ghost-like in the thaw. Etta stepped onto the porch. From the hilltop she could see the faint smoke of the town's chimneys, and beyond that, the long road curling west into nothing. She thought of the faces that would be watching those hills, whispering her name, inventing reasons to hate it. Yet here she was, alive. A man's boots by her door and warmth in her hearth. When she looked back, Reed was standing inside the doorway, hat in hand. His eyes met hers. Not questioning, not promising, simply there. She nodded once. "We'll need more firewood," she said. "I'll get it," he replied. By the time the sun rose high enough to melt the icicles from the eaves, the two of them were working side by side, stacking logs in neat rows. The town below might whisper all it wanted. Up here, the only sound was the ring of steel against wood and the echo of their breath in the cold air. For the first time in years, Etta realized she wasn't moving through silence alone. There was another heartbeat beside hers, steady, unhurried, refusing to leave. And somewhere beyond the hill, unseen, the riders turned their horses home, carrying their whispers back to the valley, leaving the cabin, for now, untouched. The next morning broke pale and brittle, the air so cold that Etta's breath turned to crystals before her face. The valley below shimmered under a thin veil of ice, every sound swallowed by the hush of winter. She had just stepped outside to draw water from the barrel when something dark moved at the edge of the clearing. A small figure, half buried in snow. For a heartbeat, she thought it was an animal. Then she saw the hand, thin and still, fingers curled like wilted petals. "Reed!" she called. He came running from the barn, coat unbuttoned, eyes narrowing against the glare. Together they reached the figure. A girl, no older than 15, her lips cracked blue, her dress stiff with frost. Etta knelt, pressing 2 fingers to the girl's throat. A pulse fluttered. Weak, but alive. Without a word, Reed lifted the child into his arms. Her head fell against his shoulder, blonde hair matted with ice. The sight of that pale braid struck something deep in Etta's chest, memory of a younger girl, laughter echoing through a classroom before smoke and screams had ended it all. They carried the child inside. Etta stripped off the wet clothes, wrapped her in blankets near the fire, and began to rub her limbs. Reed brought water, built the flames higher. The girl's teeth chattered. Then her body convulsed as life fought its way back. "She's burning," Etta whispered. She pressed a hand to the girl's forehead. The skin blazed with fever beneath the chill. Get the herbs from the shelf. No, the jar with the green label. Reed obeyed without question. He watched as Etta mixed a paste, her hands moving with the certainty of someone who'd done this before. She spread the mixture over the girl's chest, wrapped her again in blankets, and sat close, murmuring soft words that were less prayer than memory. Hours passed. Outside, the wind fell silent. Even the birds seemed to wait. When the girl finally stirred, her lashes trembled, and a small sound slipped from her throat, a name Etta hadn't heard in a decade. Grant, the girl whispered. Etta froze. The world seemed to narrow to the size of that single word. Reed looked up from the fire, sensing the shift. You know her? Etta nodded slowly. Her father burned the school. Said I cursed the children when I tried to teach them to read beside his own. Her voice was flat, steady as stone. 3 died. They called it God's justice. Reed's jaw tightened. And she's his daughter. Yes, Etta said. Nora Grant. She turned back to the girl, who now lay breathing shallow but steady. A choice unfolded in front of her, clear as the tracks in snow. She could do nothing. Let nature take back what cruelty had sown. Or she could fight for the life of a child whose family had destroyed her own. When she met Reed's eyes, she saw that he understood the war inside her. He didn't speak. He only reached for his coat and draped it across her shoulders. The weight of it was grounding, like a hand saying, "You already know what you'll do." Etta moved before doubt could root. She boiled more water, crushed more herbs, and sat by Nora's side through the long day and into the night. When the fever broke, the girl's lips parted in a breath so fragile, Etta almost missed it. Near dawn, Reed found Etta asleep in the chair, head tilted against the bedpost. He covered her with a second blanket. The fire had burned low, painting everything in soft amber. The child slept, her cheeks no longer ghostly, but flushed faintly pink. When Etta woke, she went to the window. The first light of morning spilled over the hills, gilding the snow. Reed was outside again, splitting wood. His movements were slower now, careful not to disturb the peace of what had just been saved. Nora stirred and opened her eyes, pupils wide with confusion. "Where am I?" "In a place that keeps you safe," Etta said. "You'll rest now." The girl tried to speak again, but could only nod before sinking back into sleep. Etta stood for a long time, watching her breathe. Then she turned to the table, to the empty cup where she'd steeped the herbs. The smell of mint and pine clung to her fingers. Outside, she heard Reed's axe fall once, twice. The rhythm even and certain. There was comfort in that sound, like the world slowly putting itself right. Later, when the girl could sit up, Reed carried her bowl of broth to the bed. Etta noticed the gentleness in his hands, the way he set the spoon down after each sip as though feeding a fragile bird. Nora smiled weakly, a flicker of warmth that seemed to thaw something neither of them had expected. By nightfall, she slept peacefully. Reed sat at the hearth, tuning one of the violin's remaining strings. Etta listened to the faint hum, the string vibrating under his fingers. Not music yet, but promise. "She'll live," he said quietly. Etta nodded, eyes on the fire. "And maybe I will too." Reed glanced up, but she didn't elaborate. She just reached over, adjusting the kettle so it wouldn't boil over. Outside, the snow began again, soft this time, falling straight and silent. Hours later, Etta returned the coat to him. It still carried the scent of pine and warmth. "Thank you," she said. He took it, folding it over one arm. "For what?" "For not saying anything when silence was kinder." Reed looked toward the bed where the girl slept. "You did right," he said simply. "Doesn't matter who she belongs to." Etta let out a slow breath. Maybe it's not about right. Maybe it's about not becoming them. Neither spoke again. The storm outside drifted into a lullaby of wind through branches. The lamp burned steady. For the first time in many winters, Etta didn't dread what morning would bring. Somewhere beyond the window, the world had begun to turn again. When she finally lay down, she dreamt not of the fire that once took everything, but of snow melting into clear streams, of footsteps leading away from the past. When morning came, the air carried a strange sweetness, the kind that sometimes follows a storm when the world doesn't yet know it's safe again. Etta stepped outside with a bucket to fetch snowmelt, and the sound of the thaw met her ears. Water slipping through eaves, the soft creak of branches freed from ice. The valley below was beginning to stir. She could see smoke columns rising from the town, twisting faintly into the brightening sky. Inside the cabin, Nora slept, her small breaths even. Reed was already up, tightening the latch on the window, the fire casting amber over his face. When Etta returned, he looked up briefly and smiled. A small thing, but it lingered longer than it should. "She's better," Etta said, nodding toward the bed. "Because of you. Because she wanted to live." Reed didn't argue. He only stirred the fire and poured her a cup of tea. Outside, the wind shifted direction, no longer pushing against the cabin but flowing down toward the valley as if carrying word of what had happened there on the ridge. By midday, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Etta froze, the bucket still in her hands. Reed moved to the window. Down the path, a woman in a heavy cloak rode a dun mare, her posture rigid, with fear and pride in equal measure. She dismounted before the porch, eyes sweeping the clearing. Etta opened the door before she could knock. The woman hesitated. Then Etta saw it, the faint resemblance around the mouth, the same sharp chin as the girl inside. "Mrs. Grant," Etta said softly. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came at first. Her eyes darted to the cabin door as though stepping inside would burn her. "They told me she'd wandered off," she managed finally. "I didn't believe—" "She's alive," Etta said, stepping aside. Mrs. Grant crossed the threshold, trembling. When she saw her daughter sleeping, she pressed a hand to her mouth, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The sight tugged at something deep in Etta's chest. She remembered her own classroom full of children once, their faces bright with wonder. She remembered smoke, the shouting, the way no one had spoken to her again afterward. "Thank you," Mrs. Grant whispered when she could speak. There's no word big enough." Etta's hands tightened around her shawl. "There never is." The woman lingered, wanting to say more but unable. She reached into her basket and set a small bundle on the table. Eggs, a loaf of bread, and a square of cloth embroidered with clumsy care. "She made it herself," Mrs. Grant murmured. Before she got sick." Etta touched the cloth lightly. "She can stay until she's strong enough to ride. The road will still be rough." Mrs. Grant nodded. When she looked up again, her eyes were wet but steadier. "People won't understand this kindness," she said. "They never did," Etta replied. "Doesn't change what's right." When Mrs. Grant left, Reed followed her to the porch, watching her mount and ride off down the frozen trail. "You've changed something," he said when he came back in. Only a fever, Etta said, though her voice trembled on the edge of something larger. That night, the wind came from the west, gentle, carrying a scent of pine and thaw. Reed mended a broken hinge while Etta sat sewing by the fire, the lamp's glow brushing her face. She could hear the quiet rhythm of his breath behind her, the creak of his chair, the slow pulse of two lives finding a kind of ordinary they hadn't known they missed. Later, when the girl was strong enough to sit by the window, she smiled shyly at Etta. Mama said you used to be a teacher, Nora said. I used to be many things, Etta replied, some of them worth remembering. Nora nodded as if she understood. Then, timidly, she said people were wrong about you. Etta turned her head, meeting the girl's eyes. People see what they need to see. Don't let them decide what's true. The girl smiled again, faint and wise in a way that didn't belong to her age. The next morning, Mrs. Grant returned with a small sled and warm blankets. Nora hugged Etta fiercely before leaving, her fingers clinging, until Reed gently eased them apart. When the mare and sled disappeared down the trail, silence filled the clearing again. But it was a softer kind of silence now, touched with gratitude instead of absence. Reed poured coffee, his hands steady. That was good, what you did, he said. Etta stared into her cup. It doesn't change the past. No, he agreed. But maybe it changes what comes next. She didn't answer. The day brightened, snow dripping from the eaves like silver strings. Reed took his coat and went outside to split wood. Etta followed later, standing at the doorway to watch him. Each swing of his axe sent small clouds of steam rising from his shoulders. When she stepped onto the porch, the air caught a new scent, the faint sweetness of thawing earth. Spring was still months away, but its first whisper was there, hidden in the wind. She found herself thinking about how the valley would look when the snow melted, how the ground would soften and green things would push through again. Maybe she'd plant something this year. A few herbs, perhaps. Maybe she'd stay. By dusk, Reed was inside again, brushing snow from his coat. It's turning, he said. Wind from the south now. Etta looked up from the table where she was folding the embroidered cloth Mrs. Grant had left. Then we might see color soon. He smiled faintly, eyes tracing her hands, the slow, careful way she pressed the cloth smooth. You ever think of going back? Down there, I mean? She shook her head. Some doors stay shut for good reason. Reed nodded, but didn't press. The lamp between them burned steady. After a while, he reached for his violin and touched the single unbroken string, drawing from it a low hum that filled the room. Etta listened. The sound wasn't quite music, but it carried something she couldn't name, a peace she hadn't known she needed. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind turned warmer still, rattling the windows as if in approval. The fire flared, then settled, and Reed's hum melted into the pulse of the flame. Etta leaned back, letting the quiet wrap around her like another blanket. For the first time since the school burned, she felt that the world was capable of mercy. And when she glanced at Reed across the flicker of light, she thought she saw it again. The same calm she'd noticed the first night he'd fallen through her door. But now there was no desperation in it, only belonging. The wind outside pressed against the cabin once more, not in anger this time, but in greeting, like an old friend returning to say that winter had begun to loosen its hold. The thaw did not come all at once. It crept into the days in secret ways, drops of water trailing from the eaves, the sudden soft give of the earth beneath a boot, the faint perfume of pine sap warming in the sun. Etta noticed it first in the mornings, when her breath no longer fogged as thickly before her face. Reed noticed it in the way the horses in the valley began to call again at dusk. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of pewter and stayed that way. The light never quite rose, never quite faded, hovering in that gray between hours where everything felt suspended. Reed was out by the shed fixing the handle of the axe when he paused, leaning on the post, watching his breath curl into the air. Etta stood by the fence, shawl drawn close, her eyes on the long line of the hills dissolving into mist. "Looks like rain," he said. "It's only waiting," she replied. "Same as everything else." They smiled faintly at each other and went back to their work. By evening, a drizzle had begun. The roof tapped lightly, an old tune played on tin. Inside, Etta hung the damp shawl by the fire and ladled soup into 2 bowls. Reed washed his hands in the basin, the water gray with dust and ash from the wood. They ate quietly, the spoons striking the bowls like muted bells. Afterward, she cleared the table while he sat by the hearth, turning the violin in his hands. The instrument had changed under his care. One string new, the crack at its neck sealed with a line of dark glue. When he ran his thumb along the polished wood, it gave a low hum, as if remembering its purpose. "You fixed it," she said. "Almost." He looked up at her then, and something in the air shifted. The lamp between them burned steady, the flame stretching tall. The drizzle outside became a steady rain. He set the violin down gently and rose. "Etta," he began, but his voice faltered, caught between gratitude and the kind of fear that keeps a man quiet his whole life. She waited. "I've been thinking," he said at last. "When the snow's gone, I should move on. There's always work farther west." She turned to the window, the reflection of the lamp soft on the glass. "You've said that before. I mean it now." "I know." Her voice was low, even. "You don't owe me anything." He stepped closer, stopping just short of her shoulder. "That's not what this is." The rain thickened. The cabin filled with its rhythm, steady and sure. She could feel the heat of him behind her, the way his breath stirred the edge of her hair. "When I came here," he said, "I didn't plan to stay longer than a night. You opened the door. You kept me alive. I don't know what that makes us, but it's more than I've had in a long time." Etta turned then. His face was closer than she'd expected, the lines around his eyes soft in the lamplight. For a long moment, they said nothing. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, like the air before a storm breaks. "I don't know what to do with peace," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said. The words hung between them. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. His was warm, calloused, steady. She didn't pull away. Outside, the rain turned to sleet, whispering against the window pane. The sound filled the space where words might have been. Etta felt her pulse beating where his thumb brushed her wrist. It wasn't hunger, nor pity, nor the wildness of youth. It was something quieter, deeper. The kind of recognition that comes when 2 solitudes finally see each other. He lifted her hand, pressed it once against his chest, then let it fall. "I'll sleep by the fire," he said softly. She nodded, though she knew neither of them would sleep much that night. Later, after she'd banked the coals, she sat by the window. The lamp was out, but the dim light from the moonless sky gave shape to everything. The table, the violin, the man resting on the floor, his coat folded beneath his head. His breathing was slow, even. Etta watched the rain trace lines down the glass, silver threads that vanished as quickly as they formed. She thought of all the winters she had spent in silence, of all the years she had taught herself that needing no one was the same as being strong. She rose quietly, crossed the floor, and laid another blanket over him. As she turned to leave, Reed's hand reached up, fingers brushing her wrist, not to hold, just to let her know he was awake. She froze. Their eyes met in the half-dark, the fire casting faint red on the ceiling. "Good night, Etta," he murmured. "Good night, Reed." The words felt too simple for what hung between them. She went back to her chair, sat down, and listened to the rain ease into a softer rhythm. At some point, she drifted into sleep, her head resting on her arm. When she woke before dawn, the rain had stopped. The world outside shimmered under a thin fog. Reed was still there by the fire, but he was sitting up now, staring into the ashes. The first light caught his profile, the quiet steadiness of a man who had decided something in the hours when the world was still. "You're leaving," she said, not asking. He looked at her, then shook his head. "Not yet. The road's still mud." She knew it wasn't the road he meant. Neither spoke again. The kettle hissed softly, the new day spreading pale across the hills. Etta stood, poured water into 2 cups, and set one in front of him. Their hands brushed as before, but this time neither flinched. They drank in silence. The rain had washed everything clean, the roof, the porch, even the air between them. The storm had passed, yet something deeper remained, like a current beneath still water. Unseen, but alive. And though neither said it, both knew that the next storm, when it came, would no longer find them alone. 3 days passed before Reed's tracks vanished under fresh snow. By then, the air had warmed enough for the sound of dripping water to mark time through each hour. The valley below was waking, thin smoke from chimneys, a dog's bark drifting faintly upward, the slow pulse of life returning after too long a freeze. But here, on the ridge, the cabin stayed quiet. Etta spent her mornings cleaning what didn't need cleaning. The table gleamed. The shelves were ordered like a prayer. She swept. She boiled water. She polished the lamp glass until it caught every shimmer of light. Reed watched her with a patience that felt like mercy. When he spoke, it was only to ask if she wanted more wood for the stove or if she'd eaten. On the 4th morning, he saddled his horse. The leather creaked under his hands. The faint smell of oil and earth filled the air. "The mud's set enough to ride," he said. Etta stood at the door, shawl around her shoulders, her face calm but pale. "Where will you go?" "West," he said. "There's work near the Bitterroots. Cattle to break. Fences to mend. And after that?" He hesitated. "Don't plan that far ahead." She nodded once, as if the answer had been expected. The horse pawed the ground. Reed placed his hat low over his eyes and fastened the strap on his coat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he reached into his saddlebag and drew out the violin. It was mended now, every string tightened, its surface gleaming faintly with oil. "I thought you might keep it," he said, holding it out. Etta shook her head. "You fixed it. It's yours. I fixed it because you believed it still could be." He pressed it into her hands. "Play it, if you ever learn how." Etta looked down at the instrument, Her reflection curved on its polished back. And if I don't? Then it'll still remind you what can be repaired. She swallowed, fingers brushing the strings. Thank you. Reed turned toward the open trail. The wind tugged at his coat. A few snowflakes swirled, slow and uncertain, as though the sky itself couldn't decide which season it wanted to be. He climbed into the saddle, hesitated, and looked back. You'll be all right? I've been all right before. That's not the same, he said. Etta smiled faintly. No, it isn't. He gave a small nod and urged the horse forward. She watched him ride down the slope until he was only a moving shadow between trees. Then nothing. The silence that followed was deep, but not cruel. Inside, she set the violin on the table, beside the lamp. The cabin felt larger now, the way it always does when someone has left behind part of themselves. She stoked the fire, but the sound of the flames only made her aware of the hollow space beneath it all. The next day, she carried on as if nothing had changed. She gathered herbs from the thawing patch behind the shed, mended the loose latch on the window, washed the bedding. By the third day, she could almost believe she'd imagined him, until she found his cup still sitting by the basin, the print of his thumb faint but visible along its rim. That night, the wind rose again. She woke to the rattle of the shutters and the smell of rain on the air. When she went to close the window, she heard it, a distant rhythm on the trail below, the steady beat of hooves against wet earth. She froze. It could have been anyone. A trader, a farmer, some stranger passing through. But her heart knew the pattern before her mind dared to hope. She lit the lamp and stepped onto the porch. The rain came down in soft, silver sheets. The darkness of the ridge swallowed sound, and for a moment there was nothing. Then, from the edge of the trees, a horse emerged. Reed's sorrel mare, reins loose, breath steaming in the chill. Reed followed on foot, leading her carefully up the path. His hat was gone. His hair was soaked dark against his forehead. What happened? She asked when he reached the porch. He looked up at her, rain dripping from his beard, his eyes clear and steady. Made it halfway down, he said. Then I changed my mind. She didn't move. The rain hissed in the fire barrel, the air thick with the scent of wet pine. I thought you had work waiting, she said. I do, he replied. Here. Etta exhaled, slow and uneven, as if she'd been holding her breath since he left. You came back for the violin, she tried, but her voice trembled. No, he said quietly. I came back because the road felt wrong without you on it. For a long time they stood there, the storm washing every sound into one endless hum. Then she stepped aside, and he entered. Inside, the room was warm. The fire burned high, reflecting off the violin's polished surface. Reed took off his coat and set it to dry. Etta poured coffee, the smell rising like memory. They drank without speaking. Outside, the rain softened, then stopped. The only sound left was the ticking of water dripping from the eaves and the faint creak of the chair when Reed leaned back. After a while, he reached across the table, his palm open. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. The gesture was simple, unremarkable, yet it held everything the past months had been building toward. The quiet trust of two people who no longer needed to fill silence with promises. The fire burned lower. Etta felt the warmth of his hand, the roughness of his skin. the steadiness of his pulse. When she finally looked up, his gaze was waiting for hers. "I won't ask again," he said softly. "But if you tell me to stay this time, I will." Etta's throat tightened. The words she wanted to say hovered like mist, too fragile to touch. Instead, she turned his hand over and traced the lines across his palm, as though reading the map of a life she already knew. "Stay," she whispered. Reed's breath left him in a quiet rush. He squeezed her hand once, firm, then released it only to rise and add another log to the fire. The flames leapt, throwing new light across the walls. Outside, the wind eased to a whisper. The world smelled of rain and cedar. Later, when Etta went to bed, the violin still lay on the table. Its strings caught the firelight, shimmering faintly in the dark. She thought of what Reed had said, that it would remind her of what can be repaired. Maybe he'd been right. She closed her eyes to the sound of him moving, quietly about the cabin, the soft creak of wood beneath his steps. And for the first time since she could remember, she didn't dread waking to an empty room. The storm outside drifted east by morning. The air was sharp and clean, and along the hill the first brave shoots of grass pressed through the thaw. Etta stood at the window, the cup warm in her hands, watching Reed step into the yard. He looked up, saw her through the glass, and tipped his hat with a smile that reached his eyes. Something inside her eased then. Not joy exactly, but peace, the kind that stays. Spring came as quietly as sleep. One morning, the world outside Etta's cabin had changed, so subtly that she almost missed it. The snow no longer glared white. It had softened into a pale shimmer where shoots of grass pierced through. The wind carried warmth instead of warning, and somewhere down the slope, water ran free for the first time in months. Reed was already outside, sleeves rolled, splitting the last of the winter logs. The rhythmic sound of the axe echoed against the ridge like a steady heartbeat. From the porch, Etta watched him for a long while, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee grown cold. He worked without hurry. Each motion was certain, practiced, the same patience he'd carried into everything since returning. There were no words between them, but none were needed. The days had found a rhythm of their own. She tended the herbs and dried them by the window. He mended what time had worn down. They moved through the cabin as if they'd lived that way forever. When he came in, the smell of earth followed him. He leaned the axe by the door and smiled at her, that quiet, unguarded smile that still startled her with its warmth. "Ground's near dry," he said. "You could plant something if you wanted." Etta nodded. "I was thinking of herbs, maybe beans if the frost's truly gone." Reed rinsed his hands in the basin. "I'll fence a patch by the shed." They fell into easy silence again, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. By afternoon, clouds gathered, low and pale, but the air stayed mild. Reed worked the soil while Etta brought out seeds wrapped in paper, relics from another life. She crouched beside him, pressing them into the dark earth with careful fingers. The smell of dirt and thaw was rich, promising. When the first drops of rain came, they didn't rush inside. They stood beneath it, faces lifted, the cool water streaking their skin. Etta laughed, a sound Reed hadn't heard before, a bright thing breaking free from all the winters she'd carried. He looked at her as though he could memorize the shape of that moment forever. Later, they sat on the porch, drying by the fire inside. The rain turned the yard to silver. From somewhere down the valley came the call of a mourning dove, low and steady. "I used to hate spring," Etta said. It meant everything would bloom except me. Reed glanced at her, eyes soft. Looks to me like you're doing fine. She smiled, not at the words, but at the way he said them, plain and sure. The lamp behind them flickered, its glow spilling across the porch boards. Reed reached for the violin resting beside the chair. He plucked a string. The note trembled into the air, clean and sure. Etta leaned back, eyes half closed. "It's not broken anymore," she murmured. "No," he said. "It just needed time." The melody that followed was simple, slow, untrained, but tender. It carried across the clearing, mingling with the rain's fading rhythm. Etta felt it move through her, the sound weaving itself into all the quiet places that used to ache. When he stopped, she looked at him and said, "If there were no roads left, would you still stay?" He set the violin down carefully. "There's nowhere I'd rather be." Evening drifted in, soft and gold. The last of the rain steamed from the roof, and the smell of wet pine filled the air. Inside, the cabin glowed, a steady warmth against the blue hush outside. Reed lit another lamp, its light catching in Etta's eyes. She rose to pour water into the kettle. He came up behind her, his hand brushing hers as he reached for a cup. The touch was brief, but it carried more truth than any promise. "Etta," he said quietly, "you don't have to keep waiting for life to happen. It's already here." She turned to him, a question in her eyes. "You think so?" "I know so." They stood there a long moment, neither moving, the lamplight stretching between them like a held breath. Outside, the storm had gone, leaving behind the hush that follows forgiveness. When the kettle whistled, Etta poured the tea. They drank on the porch, watching the valley turn from gray to gold as the sun slipped below the ridgeline. The air smelled of damp soil and new beginnings. Reed set his cup down and said, "You ever miss the town?" "Sometimes," she admitted. Not the people, but the sound of footsteps. The proof that life was still happening somewhere. He looked toward the faint lights below. "You've got footsteps enough here." She laughed softly. "Only yours." "That's enough for me." Night crept in slow, velvet dark, settling over the hills. One by one, the stars appeared, clear and sharp as nails in the cold sky. The two of them sat until the fire turned to embers, speaking little, each content in the silence they had built together. When Reed finally rose, he took the lamp from her hand and set it on the table inside. "You should rest," he said. "And you?" "I'll stay up a while." Etta nodded, stepping toward the doorway. She paused there, looking back at him, the man who had once knocked on her door as a half-frozen stranger and now stood inside as if he'd always belonged. "Good night, Reed." "Good night, Etta." She went to bed with the window open, letting the scent of spring drift through. From the other room came the faint hum of a violin string, low and steady. It wasn't a song, not yet, just the sound of something learning how to live again. When morning came, light spilled through the window, warm and certain. Etta rose, drew the curtain aside, and smiled. The garden outside was streaked with green. The world had kept its promise. Reed was already in the yard, mending the fence, his shadow long in the early light. He looked up when she stepped out, tipping his hat in greeting. She crossed the yard and handed him a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing in passing. The air was full of bird song and the scent of wet earth. Etta stood beside him, watching the hills bloom with color. "It's a good season," she said. He nodded. "A season to stay." And for once, she believed him. The wind swept softly across the valley, bending the young grass, carrying the sound of laughter and hammer and distant bells. Inside the cabin, the lamp still burned on the table, its flame steady, reflected in the curve of the violin, bright enough to light the whole small world they had made. If this story stayed with you, even for a moment, tell me what part touched you most in the comments below. Your thoughts keep these stories alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay close, because next time another quiet corner of the West will open its door to you.